The moment a machine humbles 20 experts is usually the moment the truth starts looking for a different door. The private exhibition hall outside Scottsdale, Arizona, was built for perfection. Bright lights reflected across polished floors. Luxury vehicles sat beneath custom displays. Investors, journalists, executives, and automotive enthusiasts moved through the crowd carrying drinks and conversations worth millions of dollars. At the center of the room stood the vehicle everyone had come to see. A deep blue Bugatti Chiron worth several $1 million rested beneath a spotlight like a piece of modern art. It belonged to Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. At 35 years old, Victoria had built a reputation for demanding excellence and usually getting it. Tonight was supposed to be another victory. Instead, the Bugatti refused to start. At first, nobody seemed concerned. Expensive cars occasionally developed unexpected problems. A few technicians approached. Then a few more. Within an hour, the atmosphere had changed. The vehicle remained silent. Victoria stood nearby with her arms folded while engineers surrounded the car. Diagnostic equipment covered nearby tables. Laptops displayed streams of data. Conversations grew increasingly serious. Every solution produced another dead end. By late afternoon, 20 engineers had examined the Bugatti. Some specialized in electronics. Others focused on performance systems. Several had impressive credentials and years of experience. None of them could explain why the vehicle would not respond. The crowd began noticing. Reporters whispered among themselves. Guests glanced toward the display. The failed launch of a flagship attraction was becoming impossible to ignore. Victoria remained composed on the outside, but frustration slowly appeared in her eyes. "What are we missing?" she asked. No one answered immediately. One engineer finally cleared his throat. "We are still reviewing several possibilities." Victoria looked at the silent Bugatti. "You have been reviewing possibilities for 6 hours." Nobody challenged the observation. Across the hall, a maintenance contractor pushed a utility cart toward a service corridor. Most guests never noticed him. His work shirt carried a simple embroidered name. Ethan Carter. 46 years old. Single father. Owner of a small maintenance company. He had spent most of the day helping event staff solve ordinary problems. Lighting issues. Equipment adjustments. Electrical checks. The kinds of tasks nobody remembered once they were finished. As Ethan passed the Bugatti display, he glanced toward the gathering of engineers. Only for a moment. Then he continued walking. 20 feet later he stopped. Something had caught his attention. Not a dramatic discovery. Not some magical insight. Just a detail. A small one. The kind people often miss when they become focused on bigger problems. Ethan looked back toward the vehicle. The engineers continued discussing data. Victoria continued waiting. Nobody noticed the maintenance contractor quietly observing from across the room. After several seconds, Ethan pushed his cart forward and disappeared through the service corridor. The Bugatti remained motionless beneath the spotlight. The engineers continued searching for answers. And somewhere in the back of Ethan's mind, a question had already begun forming. A question nobody in that room had asked yet. By 7 o'clock that evening, the exhibition hall looked less like a luxury showcase and more like a command center. Diagnostic cables stretched across the floor. Equipment cases sat open beside the vehicle. Engineers moved between laptops and technical manuals while event staff quietly redirected guests away from the growing spectacle. The longer the problem remained unsolved, the more attention it attracted. Victoria Sterling stood near the Bugatti with remarkable composure, but those who worked closely with her could see the difference. Her patience was beginning to wear thin. "Run the system check again," one engineer said. We already did, another replied. Then run it again. Nobody liked the answer, but nobody had a better one. Across the property, Ethan Carter finished replacing a faulty electrical connection in one of the service corridors. The task took less than 10 minutes. When he finished, he packed away his tools and checked the time. His daughter would be waiting for his call later that evening. 12-year-old Emma Carter never cared whether her father worked around luxury cars or million-dollar events. She only cared that he remembered to call. Ethan smiled slightly at the thought. Before leaving, he stopped near a maintenance office to complete paperwork. A television mounted on the wall displayed live coverage from inside the exhibition hall. Even there, the silent vehicle had become the main attraction. Several staff members watched while discussing the situation. 20 engineers, one man said. That cannot be good. Another shook his head. That car probably has more computers than my house. Ethan continued filling out forms without saying anything. Yet his mind drifted back to the detail he had noticed earlier. Not the engine. Not the electronics. Something else. A question continued lingering. Why was everyone looking in the same direction? The television showed another engineer opening a panel near the rear section of the vehicle. More testing. More discussion. More theories. Ethan quietly finished his paperwork. Meanwhile, Victoria listened as a senior engineer explained a new possibility. There may be a communication fault inside the control network. Maybe? Victoria asked. The engineer hesitated. We cannot confirm yet. She nodded once. Professional. Controlled. But the answer was not satisfying. 6 hours earlier, everyone seemed confident. Now certainty had disappeared. Around 8 o'clock, several guests finally left the event. Others stayed specifically to see how the situation ended. The Bugatti had become a public puzzle. No one wanted to miss the solution. Ethan pushed his utility cart toward the employee exit. As he passed through the main hall one final time, he slowed briefly near the display area. Nobody noticed him. The engineers remained focused on data screens. Victoria remained focused on results. Ethan studied the vehicle from a distance. Just a few seconds. Then he looked away. The same small detail caught his attention again. The same question. Returned. This time it felt stronger. Not because he had discovered an answer. Because nobody else seemed interested in asking it. Ethan left the hall and stepped into the warm Arizona evening. Behind him, the engineers continued searching. The Bugatti remained silent beneath the lights. And somewhere between the parking lot and the highway home, a maintenance contractor most people would never remember began wondering whether the real problem was not hidden inside the machine at all. The next morning, the exhibition reopened under a cloud of quiet embarrassment. The luxury vehicles still gleamed beneath carefully arranged lighting. Guests still arrived wearing expensive watches and tailored suits. Yet every conversation eventually drifted toward the same question. Why was the vehicle still sitting motionless? By 9 o'clock, additional specialists had arrived. Some represented manufacturers. Others came from consulting firms. Their credentials impressed everyone except the machine refusing to cooperate. Victoria Sterling stood near the display reviewing updates she had already heard 3 times. More diagnostic reports. More technical theories. More uncertainty. What is the current status? She asked. A senior engineer adjusted his glasses before answering. We have eliminated several possible causes. Victoria looked at the silent vehicle. Have we identified the actual cause? The engineer hesitated. Not yet. The answer landed heavily. Nearby reporters pretended not to listen. They listened anyway. Several feet away, another group of engineers debated software communication pathways. A third team reviewed electrical architecture diagrams. Everyone worked hard. Nobody appeared careless. That was what made the situation so unusual. Intelligent people were applying serious effort and making no progress. Around midday, Ethan Carter returned to the property to complete additional maintenance work requested by event management. He parked his service truck behind the exhibition center and spent the next hour inspecting backup power systems. The work was routine. Quiet. Predictable. The exact opposite of what was happening inside the main hall. During a short break, he walked through a service entrance carrying a toolbox. As he passed the display area, he noticed the crowd surrounding the vehicle had grown even larger. The Bugatti had become a public mystery. Ethan slowed slightly. One engineer was explaining a complex theory involving system synchronization. Another suggested replacing multiple components entirely. Ethan listened for a few seconds. Then he continued walking. Yet something continued bothering him. Not because he thought the engineers were incompetent. Quite the opposite. Most of them clearly knew their profession. That was why their shared assumption interested him. Every discussion seemed to begin from the same premise. The problem had to be complicated. Ethan reached the maintenance office and placed his toolbox on a table. A few minutes later, an event supervisor entered carrying paperwork. "Have you heard about the car?" the supervisor asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Hard to avoid." The supervisor laughed. 20 engineers and still nothing. Ethan looked down at the paperwork. Sometimes large groups focus on the same thing. Meaning? Ethan shrugged. Nothing. The supervisor waited for more. None came. Later that afternoon, Victoria walked past a row of temporary workstations where engineers continued examining data. Frustration was beginning to replace confidence. Deadlines approached. Guests continued asking questions. The silent vehicle remained exactly where it had been the day before. As Victoria turned toward the display, she noticed a maintenance contractor standing near a service corridor. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She recognized him only because he seemed unusually calm compared to everyone else in the building. Then he disappeared through a doorway. Victoria looked away almost immediately. The moment meant nothing to her. Yet behind that doorway, Ethan Carter had finally identified the question nobody else appeared willing to ask. And once the right question appears, the wrong answers rarely survive for long. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside the exhibition center had shifted from confidence to exhaustion. The engineers were still working, but the energy was different now. The easy theories had failed. The obvious explanations had disappeared. What remained was frustration hidden behind professional language. Victoria Sterling stood near a temporary workstation reviewing yet another technical report. Every page seemed to contain more possibilities and fewer answers. She set the report down. "Start from the beginning," she said. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks. One finally spoke. "We already have." Victoria nodded slowly. "Then perhaps we started in the wrong place." The comment lingered in the air. Nobody responded. Across the hall, Ethan Carter was replacing a damaged electrical outlet near a service entrance. The job required less than 15 minutes. While he worked, he could hear fragments of conversation drifting from the main display area. Diagnostic protocols. Network communication failures. Software verification sequences. Complex explanations continued multiplying. Ethan tightened the final screw and stood. For a moment he simply listened. Then he closed his toolbox. Something about the entire situation felt increasingly familiar. Not because he had worked on a Bugatti before. He had not. But machines rarely cared about reputation. Expensive machines and ordinary machines often failed for surprisingly similar reasons. As Ethan walked through the exhibition hall, he noticed several engineers gathered around a laptop displaying streams of data. Nearby, Victoria questioned another specialist. The discussion sounded intelligent, detailed, thorough. Yet one thing continued bothering him. Everyone seemed focused on proving what the problem was. Nobody seemed interested in proving what it was not. Ethan slowed near the edge of the crowd. Nobody paid attention to him. He was just a maintenance contractor carrying a toolbox. One engineer pointed toward a diagram. The issue must be originating somewhere inside this sequence. Ethan quietly studied the display for a few seconds. Then he looked toward the vehicle itself. Not the screens. Not the reports. The car. His eyes settled briefly on a particular area before moving away. A moment later he continued walking. 20 minutes later, Victoria received another update. It was not encouraging. Several replacement components had already been tested. None changed the outcome. The vehicle remained silent. Guests continued asking questions. Journalists continued watching. The situation had become increasingly uncomfortable. As Victoria turned away from the display, she noticed the same maintenance contractor she had seen earlier. This time he was speaking with an event supervisor. Their conversation appeared casual. Ordinary. Yet something about the supervisor's expression caught her attention. He looked surprised. Curious. Almost confused. After a minute, the supervisor laughed softly and shook his head. Ethan smiled, picked up his toolbox, and started walking away. The supervisor watched him leave before looking back toward the vehicle. Victoria frowned slightly. Several minutes later she approached the supervisor. "Everything all right?" The man nodded. "Yes." Then he hesitated. "Although something strange just happened." Victoria waited. "What?" The supervisor looked toward the corridor where Ethan had disappeared. One of the maintenance contractors asked a question about the car. Victoria folded her arms. "And?" The supervisor gave a small shrug. "Honestly, it was the first question I have heard all day that nobody could answer." For the first time since the problem began, Victoria felt something different from frustration. She felt curiosity. Curiosity can be far more dangerous than certainty. Once Victoria Sterling started asking questions, she found it increasingly difficult to stop. The maintenance supervisor's comments stayed with her throughout the evening. One simple question. A question nobody could answer. That detail bothered her more than another failed diagnostic report. By the following morning, the exhibition had entered its third day. The engineers remained fully committed. New equipment arrived. Additional specialists joined conference calls. Technical discussions continued from sunrise until late afternoon. Yet the vehicle remained exactly where it had been. Silent. Unmoving. Expensive. Victoria walked through the display area reviewing updates she no longer expected to improve her mood. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every theory sounded intelligent. None produced results. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter arrived shortly after 8 o'clock to complete scheduled maintenance inspections throughout the facility. His routine looked almost identical to the previous day. Service corridors. Electrical panels. Climate control systems. Ordinary work. Nobody watching him would have guessed he had spent part of the previous evening thinking about the vehicle. Around lunchtime, Ethan entered a storage area near the main hall. While organizing equipment, he heard two engineers discussing the situation nearby. One mentioned software architecture. Another argued for replacing additional components. Ethan listened quietly while checking inventory numbers. Then one sentence caught his attention. At this point we are assuming the original signal path is functioning correctly. Ethan paused for a moment. Just a moment. Then he returned to work. Several minutes later he stepped into the hallway carrying a toolbox. The same engineer happened to be walking past. Ethan spoke politely. "Can I ask you something?" The engineer looked surprised. "Sure." Ethan nodded toward the display area. "Has anyone independently verified that assumption?" The engineer frowned. "Which assumption?" "The original signal path." A brief silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence. A thoughtful one. The engineer crossed his arms. "Why?" Ethan shrugged lightly. "Just curious." Before the engineer could ask another question, Ethan continued down the hallway. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. Yet the engineer remained standing there long after Ethan disappeared around the corner. Later that afternoon, Victoria noticed something unusual. Several engineers had stopped discussing replacement theories and started re-examining earlier conclusions. The shift seemed subtle at first. Then she realized entire teams were reviewing information they had already dismissed. "What changed?" she asked. One of the senior specialists hesitated before answering. Someone raised a question. Victoria looked up. "What question?" The engineer glanced toward the display area. "Whether we ever proved one of our key assumptions." Victoria immediately thought of the maintenance contractor. "And did we?" she asked. The engineer looked uncomfortable. "Not exactly." For the first time in 3 days, genuine uncertainty appeared among the experts. Not uncertainty about the problem. Uncertainty about their process. Across the facility, Ethan stood outside speaking with his daughter on the phone during a short break. Emma described a science project. Ethan listened carefully. He asked questions. He laughed at one of her jokes. When the call ended, he looked at the time and returned to work without another thought. He never mentioned the vehicle. Never mentioned the engineers. Never mentioned the question. Yet inside the exhibition hall, that question continued spreading from one expert to another. And slowly, almost reluctantly, 20 highly trained engineers began looking somewhere they should have looked from the very beginning. The breakthrough did not arrive with excitement. It arrived with silence. Early the next morning, several engineers gathered around a temporary workstation reviewing data they had already examined dozens of times. Only now they were looking at it through a different lens. Instead of asking what had failed, they were asking what had been assumed. The distinction seemed small. It was not. Victoria Sterling watched from nearby as conversations became more focused. Less dramatic. More careful. For the first time in days, nobody was proposing complicated solutions. They were questioning basic conclusions. Around 10 o'clock, one of the engineers approached Victoria. "We found something unusual." Her attention sharpened immediately. "What?" The engineer pointed toward a series of diagnostic results. One of the original verification procedures may have produced a misleading result. Victoria stared at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning we might have been troubleshooting the wrong system." The words landed heavily. Days of work. Thousands of labor hours. Entire teams of specialists. And now there was a possibility they had been chasing the wrong problem. Across the facility, Ethan Carter was finishing a routine inspection of a backup generator system. The task required concentration but little urgency. He preferred work like that. Machines tended to be honest. They either functioned or they did not. People often complicated things. While packing his tools, he received a text message from Emma. A photograph appeared on the screen. She stood beside a science fair display, smiling proudly. Ethan smiled back at the image. A moment later another message arrived. "Wish me luck." Ethan replied immediately. "You do not need luck. You worked for it." Then he put the phone away and returned to work. Meanwhile, inside the exhibition hall, the engineers continued pulling apart assumptions one by one. Around noon, one of them finally noticed something nobody had questioned before. A small inconsistency. Tiny. Almost invisible. Yet once discovered, it changed the entire direction of the investigation. Discussions accelerated. Data was reviewed again. Verification procedures were repeated. Several engineers suddenly became very quiet. Victoria recognized that look. It was the expression people wore when they realized they had overlooked something important. An hour later she was standing beside the vehicle when the same engineer approached again. This time his voice sounded different. Less uncertain. "We think we know where to look." Victoria folded her arms. "How long?" He hesitated. "Not long." Nearby reporters sensed the shift immediately. Conversation spread through the crowd. Guests moved closer. Expectations returned. Yet amid the growing attention, one detail continued bothering Victoria. The entire change had begun with a question from a maintenance contractor. She looked around the exhibition hall. Ethan was nowhere in sight. Several minutes later she found him in a service corridor adjusting equipment near a wall panel. He looked exactly the same as he had every other day. Calm. Focused. Unimpressed by the surrounding chaos. Victoria approached slowly. Ethan glanced up. "Everything working?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Most things." Victoria studied him for a moment. "The engineers think they finally found something." Ethan nodded. "That is good." The answer felt almost too simple. She waited for more. None came. Then Ethan closed his toolbox and looked at his watch. "If they are looking in the right place now," he said quietly, "they may not need much time." Victoria watched him walk away. For the first time since this entire situation began, she found herself wondering whether the most important person in the building had never been standing near the Bugatti at all. The crowd sensed the change before anyone announced it. Something had shifted inside the exhibition hall. Engineers moved with renewed purpose. Conversations became shorter. Focus became sharper. The uncertainty that had dominated the previous 3 days was slowly being replaced by direction. Victoria Sterling stood beside the display area watching specialists move between diagnostic stations and the vehicle itself. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was making predictions. But for the first time since the problem began, people looked like they believed an answer existed. Shortly after 2 o'clock, one of the lead engineers requested another full verification sequence. Equipment was connected. Measurements were repeated. Procedures that had once seemed routine were now treated with unusual care. Every assumption was questioned. Every conclusion was tested again. Nearby reporters watched from behind a barrier. Guests gathered along the edge of the display area. The atmosphere felt different now. Quieter. More serious. Across the property, Ethan Carter finished a maintenance inspection and loaded several tools into his service truck. His workday was nearly over. He checked his phone and saw a message from Emma. "Science fair went great." Ethan smiled. A second message followed almost immediately. "Can we get pizza tonight?" Ethan laughed softly and typed a simple reply. "Absolutely." He placed the phone back in his pocket and prepared to leave. Inside the exhibition hall, a small group of engineers surrounded the Bugatti. One final verification confirmed what they had begun to suspect earlier that day. The original assumption had been wrong. Not completely wrong. Just wrong enough to send everyone in the wrong direction. The discovery triggered a series of rapid adjustments. Several engineers exchanged looks that mixed relief with embarrassment. One of them shook his head. "We should have checked this days ago." Another nodded. Nobody disagreed. Victoria listened carefully. "Can it be corrected?" she asked. The lead engineer looked toward the vehicle. "Yes." A simple answer. Yet it carried enormous weight. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then the team returned to work. 20 minutes later, a crowd had formed around the display. Word traveled quickly. Even people who knew nothing about engineering understood something important was happening. Cameras appeared. Conversations stopped. The exhibition hall grew unexpectedly quiet. Victoria stood near the front watching every movement. The engineers completed their final procedures and stepped back. One of them moved toward the driver's seat. Another gave a small nod. Then everyone waited. The moment felt strangely ordinary after so much anticipation. No dramatic speeches. No grand announcement. Just a room full of people holding their breath. Across the parking lot, Ethan was preparing to leave when a distant sound reached him through the open service entrance. He stopped. The sound lasted only a moment. Yet it was enough. Ethan smiled faintly. Then he continued loading his tools. Back inside, the silence shattered. The vehicle had finally responded. Conversations exploded throughout the hall. Reporters rushed forward. Guests applauded. Engineers exchanged exhausted smiles. Victoria remained standing exactly where she was. Relief washed across her face. But relief was not the only emotion she felt. Because while everyone else was celebrating the solution, she found herself thinking about a maintenance contractor who had never touched the vehicle, never demanded attention, and yet somehow changed the direction of the entire investigation with a single question. The celebration continued long after the engineers completed their work, but Victoria Sterling found it difficult to focus on the congratulations. Investors approached her. Reporters requested comments. Guests wanted photographs beside the vehicle that had become the center of attention for 3 straight days. She handled every conversation professionally, yet her thoughts kept returning to the same person. Ethan Carter. The maintenance contractor who never asked for credit. The man who had changed everything without ever touching the spotlight. The following afternoon, Victoria made a decision. Instead of returning directly to corporate meetings, she asked her assistant to gather information. Nothing invasive. Just basic background. What she received surprised her. Ethan owned a small maintenance company. His business served schools, community centers, churches, and local organizations throughout the region. He had been offered larger opportunities over the years. Several former clients described him as exceptionally skilled. One even mentioned that Ethan had once declined a senior engineering position with a major firm. Victoria read the file twice. The decision made little sense. The salary alone would have transformed most people's lives. Yet Ethan had refused. Late that afternoon, curiosity led her somewhere unexpected. A middle school on the edge of town. Students and parents filled the parking lot after a science recognition event. Victoria remained near her vehicle, careful not to draw attention to herself. Then she saw him. Ethan stood near the entrance speaking with a young girl holding a certificate and a display board. Emma Carter. 12 years old. Bright smile. Proud eyes. Ethan listened as she talked. Really listened. The way people listen when nothing else matters. Emma pointed toward her project. Ethan examined every detail as though it were the most important presentation in the world. Several parents walked past. A few greeted him by name. Ethan greeted them warmly. No one treated him like a hidden genius. No one treated him like the man who had quietly redirected a room full of experts. They simply treated him like Emma's father. Victoria watched as the two walked toward a nearby pizza restaurant. Along the way, Emma continued talking while Ethan carried her project board. At one point she laughed. Ethan laughed too. The moment felt ordinary. Yet somehow it explained more than any background report ever could. For years Victoria had measured success through growth charts. Acquisitions, valuations, and achievements. Ethan appeared to measure it differently. Not because he lacked ambition. Because he had chosen something else. As she sat inside her car, Victoria remembered his words from the previous day. If they are looking in the right place now, they may not need much time. No arrogance. No need for recognition. Just quiet certainty. For the first time, she began understanding what made him different. His confidence was not built on titles. It was built on experience. On patience. On years of solving problems without needing applause afterward. As Ethan and Emma disappeared inside the restaurant, Victoria remained seated for several moments. Then she looked away and smiled faintly. The mystery that had begun with a silent machine was finally revealing something much larger. The most valuable person in the room had never been the loudest, the richest, or the most visible. He had simply been the man who knew exactly who he was. 3 months later, most people had forgotten about the breakdown. News cycles moved on. New products launched. New headlines appeared. Yet for Victoria Sterling, the experience remained impossible to forget. What began as a technical problem had quietly become something much more valuable. On a warm Friday afternoon, Sterling Dynamics hosted a community innovation event at its Arizona headquarters. Local schools were invited. Small business owners attended. Students displayed engineering projects throughout the campus. Victoria walked through the exhibition hall greeting guests when she noticed a familiar name on the participant list. Emma Carter. She smiled immediately. A few minutes later she found Ethan standing beside his daughter near a display table covered with science materials and diagrams. Emma was enthusiastically explaining her project to a group of judges. Ethan stood nearby, listening with the same patient attention Victoria had seen months earlier. Nothing about him had changed. Same calm expression. Same quiet confidence. Victoria approached. Ethan noticed her and nodded politely. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," Victoria replied. For a moment they watched Emma continue her presentation. The judges seemed impressed. Victoria looked at Ethan. "She is remarkable." Ethan smiled. "She works hard." The answer sounded familiar. He never exaggerated. Never claimed credit that belonged to someone else. As the event continued, Emma's project received one of the highest scores of the day. When the award ceremony ended, she ran toward her father carrying a certificate and a small trophy. Ethan congratulated her as though she had just won the most important award in the world. Watching them together, Victoria finally understood something that had taken months to fully appreciate. The most successful person she had met that year was not standing on a stage. He was standing beside his daughter. Later that evening, as guests began leaving, Victoria found Ethan near the parking area. The setting sun painted long shadows across the pavement. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Ethan nodded. "Of course." Victoria looked toward the distant mountains before speaking. "You could have had a different career. Larger companies. Larger titles. More money. Why did you choose this life?" Ethan considered the question carefully. Then he looked toward Emma, who was waiting nearby. "Because success is easy to measure when it belongs to you," he said quietly. "The harder question is whether the people who depend on you are better because you were there." Victoria remained silent. Ethan smiled faintly. "That answer became simple the day I became a father." Neither spoke for several seconds. The evening breeze moved gently through the parking lot. Finally Victoria nodded. She understood. Not completely. Perhaps nobody could unless they had lived his life. But she understood enough. Ethan walked toward Emma. She immediately began telling him another story from her day. He listened just as carefully as always. Together they headed toward their truck while the lights of the event glowed behind them. Victoria watched them leave until they disappeared beyond the parking lot entrance. Then she smiled. Months earlier, 20 engineers had searched for an answer inside a machine. In the end, the most important lesson had never been hidden inside the vehicle at all. It had been standing quietly nearby the entire time. And unlike any machine, its value had nothing to do with what it could do. Its value came from who it chose to be.